Welcome to Sharkfelt, where I felt that. Unfortunately, I couldn't make a Halloween or Christmas special due to moving to a new place, so we're just going to needlefelt Gloomy Bear instead. As usual, I start making the head by rolling up a large tuft of core wool, then begin poking at it with my largest felting needle to help it hold the desired shape. Eventually, switching over to my 3-pronged felting tool, I repeat this process until the wool tuft looks like a large white olive. Then I wrap that olive in more core wool and rotate it as I stab it with the felting tool to make the object bigger. As you've probably noticed by now, I got a new setup, along with some new felting tools, which are mostly the same, just higher quality and in a different color. Figured I'd mention it, since it's fitting how the tools are pink and so is the character I'm crafting. Anyways, once the head is the proper size, I create the body using the same method as before, except this time we want to make the shape a little longer and thinner than the head was. Ideally, the wool for the body will come out looking like a teardrop without the pointy bit at the top. With the base of the body done, we'll now felt the legs using the same process once more, with the same core wool of course. However, this time around, we want 2 wool pieces in the form of tall-looking marshmallows. I try to keep them as symmetric as possible, although it doesn't matter much because the end result ended up not being able to stand on its own anyway. For Gloomy's arms, I wanted to try some dynamic posing by using wire armature, so I cut some bendable craft wire a little longer than the length of his body from the neck down. Then, fold the ends into themselves with a pair of pliers so that they don't jut out of the soft felt material in the future. If I don't do this step, they'll be sharp enough to poke through the fibers and out of the piece. Now I'll lay the armature on top of a carded piece of core wool, then incorporate it into the middle of the wool by using a large felting needle to fold bits of fluff over the wire to keep it centered in the arm throughout the process. With all the main components bases done, I can finally whip out my long-awaited Barbie pink wool and start coloring the body. I complete this by laying a carded, medium-sized tuft of it down on the body, then gently felt in a layer of the pink wool into the top of the core wool with my 3-pronged felting needle. I work carefully because if I push the needle in too deep, I'd effectively be forcing the pink wool into the center of the core wool body, since that's just how felting needles behave. I color the legs in mostly the same way, however this time I leave the pink wool uncarded and just wrap it around the skinny part because it's just easier that way for cylindrical pieces. For the bottom of the feet, I felt in a small piece of carded pink wool, then for the top of the legs I use a larger piece of the same wool, but this time I only stab in the center and leave some fluff on the edges for easy attachment later on in the project. Now I'll color in the arms, being cautious as to not poke the wire armature directly with my needles as much as possible. This is because it's a very easy way to break said needles and then have to replace them. Actually, I think I did break 1 or 2 working on this part while I wasn't recording. With both arms fully colored, I move on to the head, largely following the same steps as before. This part takes a while because Gloomy Bear has a big ol' noggin, which I have to cover the entire surface area of with pink wool of course. Slowly but surely, I color in the entire head and we can now move on to attaching the legs to the body. I accomplish this by pushing pins in through the legs into the bottom of the body to hold everything in place, while I poke in the remaining bits of fluff to join the legs to the body with a large felting needle. Once everything is attached and smoothed down, I inevitably am left with some white core wool peeking through the pink after connecting the legs to the body. To fix this, I just cover it back up by poking in a little more pink wool on top of the white areas. Now that the body with legs attached is colored, I can begin adding details to the head. I'll start by pushing some pins into the head to use as guides for the rest of the face. Then, I'll get out my white wool and place a small amount of it at the bottom of the head to set off creating his snout. I start the process with a large felting needle to help the white fibers connect to the pink ones on the head, then eventually switch over to my 3-pronged felting tool to speed up the shaping of the snout. I wanted it to be more 3D as shown on the sticker sheet I found online, so I bulk up the muzzle with more white wool, then felt it back down into shape so he doesn't look like he's been stung by a bee. Once his snoot is the correct size, I move on to making the eyes by taking out my maroon colored wool, then place a little bit of it on the sides of the face and felt in vertical ovals, mainly following the same steps as before to attach the snout. To craft the nose, it's essentially the same method as the last step, however this time you'll want to keep the nose mostly flat. Soon, we'll be joining the head to the body, but to do this, we'll first need to place a large tuft of pink wool on top of the neck, then felt in only the center of it, leaving a lot of stray fluff around the edges to help us connect the two pieces together. Now, I pin the head down onto the neck to hold it in place, while I felt down the extra fluff from the neck into the head to join it to the body. If that makes any sense. That was a lot of instructions at once. My bad. Moving on, the same thing that happened to the legs happened to the neck, of course, so we'll just cover up the white wool with more pink wool and smooth down Gloomy's accidental hunchback while we're at it. Next, I'll get my red wool out from its packaging and begin adding his blood, or pomegranate drool, depending on if he's been hanging out with Pity or not, onto his mouth. I do this by using my finest felting needle to poke in the little details and curves of the drool. Then I repeat the same process on the chest that I used on the mouth. Now that I've finished adding blood to the core body, I take out a stencil with a small peach cutout on it and use only the half of it without leaves to create his ears. I do have a stencil with varying circle cutouts on it, but none of the circles were the right size in proportion to his head, so a peach stencil will have to do. Once the pink wool used for his ears is holding its form well enough, I pop it out of the stencil and continue working on it free-handedly. Next, I'll make the creases in his ears by using a large felting needle to form a divot in the wool that swerves off from the center towards the outer ear as shown in my reference image. Now I'll attach them by pinning them in place and poking them in with the same large felting needle, gradually switching over to my finest felting needle to smooth out the transition between the head and ear. To craft the tail, I bunch up a tuft of pink wool and stab all around it with a large felting needle yet again to help set its shape. Then switch over to my 3-pronged one to speed up the process while keeping it in the shape of an egg. Using the same method I did for the ears, I connect the tail to the body. Returning to Gloomy's arms, I bend the wire within them at a 90-degree angle so that I can stab them into place at his theoretical shoulder joints. Before I can do that though, I need to make his juicy claws. I'll accomplish this by putting a bit of white and red wool into a blunt-tipped teardrop-shaped cutout on a stencil, then I'll poke them together at the same time with my finest felting needle to join them to one another as a single solid object. Keeping the claw within the stencil, I'll start to add its gooey blood streaks with the same needle and then pop it out of said stencil. Next, I'll just repeat these steps 5 more times until I have a total of 6 claws. Then I pin the claws into place onto the hands to get an idea of where I want them to sit in the end. Now I'm cutting my smaller black bendable wire down to size and curling one end into itself so that it doesn't poke out of the claws. Then I use my awl to hollow out the inside of the claws so that I can insert the wire into the center of it. Using the same tool, I make a deep hole in the arm where I want the claw to reside, then, using the extra bit of wire sticking out from the claw, I embed it into the armhole and push it around, bending the wire a little until it's in place. Next, I use my smallest felting needle to fully attach the white wool of the claw to the pink wool of where his knuckle would be, making sure I don't leave any gaps which might expose the wire in between the two pieces. I use the same method on every single claw on each hand until that step is complete. To connect the arms to the rest of the body, I first have to cut the wires down to size with my pliers, so that they'll actually fit inside the chest without poking out of the sides. Now I'll use my awl to bore a hole through his shoulders, which I will then stab the metal peeking out from the arms into. This took a little pushing and prodding for it to stay posed, but it was easy enough. Using a medium felting needle, I poke the wool from the arm into the wool of the body to firmly attach it, hide the wire, and set their position. Over time, I realized Gloomy's claws weren't looking bloody enough to me, so I went ahead and added a couple more streaks of red wool to them off camera. Additionally, I added more maroon wool to the grooves in his ears so that the creases in them were more defined from afar. Finally, I unsheathed my small shears and cut away at the stray hairs to finish off the project. Since the video is coming to an end, I wanted to tell you all that I won't be doing voiceovers in my future videos, simply because it takes too long and I want to pump out content faster for y'all. Please consider subscribing, and now let's look at the glamour shots.